Hi everyone, I'm Scott Schneider. This is Stereo Niche. Hey, this week we're going to talk about the phono stage. All right, so it's the holiday season and the fall has already come in and now we're heading into winter. And in those months, I kind of like to bring out the tube gear. So I set this system up on this side of the room and thought I would talk a little bit more about some things I like to pair with tube gear, and that's a Phono Preamp. So before we got into that, I thought maybe let's talk about Phono Preamps. What are they? Could be some folks that don't really know what one is. So I thought just do a quick overview. I'm by no means the ultimate expert on them, but we could talk in general, what are they and why are they necessary? So a phono, the phono connections, let's go back for a turntable. So a turntable has the needle hitting the record and it's creating a very, very, very minute signal. And you can even hear it slightly if you put your ear up. You can actually hear it very, very delicately playing on the record. Well, that's a very small signal. So the output signal from a turntable is very tiny. And for that reason, it needs a significant amount of amplification before it gets to the final amplifier and gets to the speakers. So when you see a configuration in the manual, in the old days anyway, a vintage audio, it was very common. They would show the turntable and that would be connected to the phono input on the receiver or the preamp or the integrated amp. And although it may look the same because it has RCA connections just like other inputs, it is not the same. So behind those RCA connections is a phono preamp. And so what that is a bit of circuitry that takes that very small signal and amps it up to what is called sort of line level, which is the same, very closely matching what you get for other types of sources like CD players, tape players. So the phono connection is very unique compared to everything else. You cannot connect a CD player or any other type of device into those phono connections, or you could damage it significantly, your amplifier. So it's a special connection only for turntables. And inclusive of that, of the RCA connections, as we know, if you've hooked up any of these, it has a ground connection as well. And that's to, ground it well and produce hum and sort of other issues that can arise for a turntable. But the main part here that we wanted to focus on is the fact that it's a different connection altogether. Now, on vintage turntables, I'm not aware that any vintage turntable ever had an inbuilt preamp. Pretty sure that's the case because back then, everything you would have connected it to had phono on it. Any integrated amp or preamp or receiver had a phono on it. It was standard back then. Currently today, there are turntables that do have inbuilt phono preamps into them. So that phono is necessary to hook that into a standard line-in connection. So you wouldn't want to take that. You want to check your guide and your manual and make sure that it doesn't say to not connect it into a phono. You just want to double check that. So be clear if you've got a new turntable, just make sure that that turntable doesn't have an inbuilt phono preamp that's already amping up that signal to line level, which is like a CD player or a tape player or some other source like that. If you were to make that mistake, it could be very impactful to your receiver or your amplifier. So you just want to make sure that's not the case. But in vintage gear, you're safe in taking any vintage turntable and connecting it to your vintage gear or into a separate preamp. Now there are a lot of preamps out there. Again, I'll reiterate, I'm no expert on them because most of the gear that I use has a fairly good phono preamp already built in. So I've not spent a lot of time with separate preamps because most of the gear I have already includes it. But there is a ton of them out there, and here's a sample of quite a few of them. They're all over the board on pricing. You can get them, below $50 all the way into the thousands, and in some cases even probably the tens of thousands. So a lot of variability with phono preamps out there. You can go strictly solid state, you can go tube, you can get as elaborate as you like and spend as much money as you like for the most part. But I don't have any recommendations. I only want to point out that for me, the one thing to look for is a preamp that can handle both moving magnet, and MC, moving coil cartridges. For me, I just like the flexibility of being able to swap around cartridges and having the flexibility of the preamp being able to accommodate them. So just something to look for if you are going to look at buying a separate preamp if you find you need one. So why do I need a preamp? For me, somebody who has a lot of gear and a lot of gear that already has, in most cases, a nice preamp built in. Well, a couple of reasons. Most gear made back in the 70s, most vintage gear, 80 and prior, always accommodated a nice phono stage, a moving magnet type of phono stage. And it was a pretty significant piece if it included the ability to handle MC cartridges. And that's why for my receiver references and my ratings, I give more points if the receiver can accommodate an MC cartridge. There's a little bit more to it to accommodate those MC cartridges. MC cartridges or moving coil cartridges have lower output, so it needs a little bit more amplification. So it takes a little bit more circuitry, a little more engineering to inbuild that into the preamp. So there's some variability in which units have a good preamp or not. So in most cases, if you're going to only use a moving magnet, then you don't really have much of an issue. You can pretty much accommodate that on just about any gear made from 1990 and prior. But if you want something that can incorporate MC, you might want to go ahead and buy an external separate preamp for that. But for me, the majority of the time that I end up using it is on tube gear. And the reason is because in the tube era, that was 60 years ago now. And the technology changed dramatically by the time the late 70s and the 80s rolled around. And there was just a lot better technology and a lot better equipment and gear from my perspective in that time frame. Now, there's certainly you could hook up an cartridge, but for me, I just think that it's a lot easier and a lot better to take a separate phono preamp and connect it into my vintage tube gear. You get for me, I like the benefit of the warmth of the tube gear, but the flexibility and the clarity that a phono preamp brings to it, in addition to the ability to handle MC cartridges. So for me, I think it's a great pairing. I often like to, for my integrated amps, my tube amps, mono blocks or dedicated amps, I just prefer to use a separate preamp in those situations. Everything else is fine. I mean, you're connecting it into the auxiliary port, the tuner port, whatever other line in that you like to use is just fine. And you get that great sound, that tube warmth that we all like. But the one thing I do like is to insert a phono preamp in between, just for a better sound from my perspective. So it's a big subject, a big area. Let me know what you guys like to use, what kind of configuration, why you like that. Chime in the conversation. I'd love to hear from you guys. All right, well, let's talk about the big mystery from last week. Now, as a reminder, I was approached by a group out of Spain, and they had a situation where they're trying to solve a certain mystery. It's a show, and they had this particular picture that they couldn't identify that's part of this mystery show that they're working on. So I shared that with you, and had some great feedback from everyone here on what could it be. And so most of the feedback zeroed in on it being some sort of hotel system that was either a hotel radio or a hotel intercom system built into, or also controlling the lights in the room, let's say. So it looks like some kind of hotel system versus a home stereo system. That seemed to be what most people seemed to think when they saw it. And that feedback came from people, I think, that were fairly well traveled or in Europe or already living in Europe that has seen those types of units in the hotel rooms of that time frame. So that seemed to be most of the feedback. Some others came back, thought maybe it was a cassette deck, perhaps some sort of controls for a cassette deck. Some of the brands mentioned. Sound design came up. Symphonic was another name that was thrown out there. One of the interesting ones was possibly a brand called Odysseus from at that time frame, what would have been called the Soviet Union. So that was interesting, not something I was ever familiar with. So interesting feedback. I shared this information with the folks from Spain who reached out. They're going to look at it and see if there's anything that I guess builds the story there or connects to them and then to the storyline that they're working on, and then get back to me and let me know if anything was beneficial. So if they reach out, I'll give you guys an update on what they said. So now let's take a look at viewer systems. A lot of folks have been sending them in. I certainly appreciate it. A lot of great feedback. If you'd like to get your system on the show here, send me a few pictures. Send me a good overview of what's in the pictures. A little bit of history about, your system. What kind of stuff do you collect, or what kind of system do you have? What got you into it? Have you always been into it? Just some details I can share with the folks here. So if you get me those, I'll try to get it on one of the future episodes. So let's kick it off. So the first system comes from Alan. Unfortunately, Alan didn't tell me where he's located, but this is probably the first, I would say, new system that I've had since I mostly focus on vintage audio. That's mostly what I've gotten, of course, but I love it all. So I'm glad he sent this in. So let's see what Alan has here. He's got some Focal Utopia Maestro Evo speakers. Those are quite impressive. I think anything from Focal is pretty impressive. So he's had those a couple of months now. He's got a preamp. It looks like pretty much a full McIntosh system here. He's got a McIntosh C12000. That's a tube and solid state preamp there. He's got both options. And let's see, he's got some McIntosh, looks like 1200 watt per channel monoblocks. And those are pretty new, like a few weeks old. He's got a Super Audio CD player from the McIntosh side of things, an MDC 12000. That's 6 months old, so everything's pretty new here. He does have a vintage piece in the system here, and that is the turntable. It's a VPI extended Aries, and that dates from way back to 2001. And he's got a new Dynavector cartridge on there, and a phono stage isn't pictured, but it's an EAR 834P tube unit. So that's Alan's pretty impressive system there. Alan, you're gonna have to send a note and tell us about your impressions, but I think you're pretty happy with all that. That looks pretty dang cool, to be honest with you. I've not heard a set of Focal speakers myself. I would love to hear a set, but those certainly look very impressive. So thank you for sending that in. The next up is from Brad from Edmonton, Ontario. Now we've got quite a few folks that watch up in Canada. So Brad has what I would say is a modern vintage looking setup here. And that is in the way he's got things set up. Now, in a lot of the, I'll say 60s time frame or era advertising, furniture and audio gear was all intermingled. It was sort of, all put together, and very similar to what Brad has here, in that he's got some AR3As. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh yes, AR3As, and these were I've talked about this before, but AR3s were called bookshelf speakers. Today, by today's standards, they're floor speakers. But back in the late 50s and early 60s, that was quite small compared to the very monstrous speakers like the Patrician and the Hartsfield, etc. Those were corner horns that took up a whole lot of space. So when AR released these, it was quite a shock that you could get such bass, such low output, out of a small enclosure. So this is how they set things up. And so that's why it's called a bookshelf, because you could actually take that speaker, as large as it is, and still put it on a bookshelf. And that's what Brad has done, although that's a modern bookshelf, inbuilt with a TV in the middle. So to power things, Brad has a Marantz PM7000 integrated amp. He had that, let's see, so that's actually still vintage. He got that in 2003, so just barely vintage. And he's got that connected to a Panasonic Blu-ray player. So the super vintage stuff is those AR3As. Those are quite cool. Thanks for sending that in, Brad. So next up, we've got a couple of receivers here from Joe V in Darlington, Maryland. So Joe writes that back in 1977, or around that time frame, his first receiver was a Pioneer SX650. It came from a place in Townsend, Maryland called Luskins. Now the guy that ran that and owned the place his name was Jack Luskins, and he claimed to be the cheapest guy in town. How'd you like to have that moniker, huh? So he paid $196 plus 4% sales tax to get his first receiver, that SX650. But unfortunately, around 1981, he sold it. And he got a Sansui 8900 DB, and he just had seller's remorse for a very long time. Then many years later, in 2012, he had a neighbor that found out he was into vintage audio and offered him his old radio. And that's what he called it anyway. So he hands it to Joe, and it turned out it was an SX650, just like he had originally. And so he was quite excited to get that. So Joe took that unit to work. He's a tech himself, and he took it sort of apart, cleaned everything very well. He took the cabinet to a professional cabinet restore place, had it re-veneered in mahogany. And then he took the unit after that to Just Audio in Parksville, Maryland, and they did a full recap on it and replaced all the lights. And so now, currently, it's residing in his living room, and it's powering 2 PSB speakers. The other picture here, he's also got an SX680 that was given to him at some point by another friend, and he had that veneered in a wormy chestnut. Quite cool, Joe. Those are pretty awesome. Thank you so much for sending those in. All right, I guess that'll do it for this week. Let's see, we covered phono preamps. You know, a lot of stuff around phono preamps. Again, I'm not the best person to tell you all the details, but I know there's some folks that are very well versed in phono preamps, and we'll probably do a little more. At some point, I'll do a little more deep dive on those and the nuances of them. But they certainly come in handy. I like to pair them with my tube gear, as I mentioned. So I'll be listening to this combination for the next month at least. The mystery picture, hopefully they'll get back to me and let me know any more details, any of that made sense to them and maybe help them figure something out. We'll see. I'll certainly circle back with them and try to get some feedback, down the road at some point. And then viewer systems, always cool. I think we all enjoy being vicarious in a way and seeing what everyone else is listening to and what's their story, and seeing the systems that they have. So, keep those coming in. Tell me the story about them, what got you into vintage audio and your history with that unit or that system. Always interesting. Don't want to miss the next video. Hit subscribe, hit that notification bell while you're there. Give us a thumbs up too. That's always helpful. Thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you next time.